Hi guys, welcome and thank you guys for coming out for our first speaker ever for College Independence, Alex Howlett. So he has been in the UBI sphere for quite a while, 10 plus years or something like that, if I remember correctly.
9
Um,
years.
9 years, okay. But he will talk about, UBI, what that is, what he's been doing, kind of the specifics of consumer monetary theory, which is like the way he frames UBI. And at the end, there will be a question and answer session. Since it's only 12 people, just go ahead and raise your hand on the participants tab or on the chat, just type in that you have a question and it'll be first come, first serve. So with all that said, Alex, you have the floor.
Okay, so I'm sure you guys have heard of basic income by now, but just so we know what we're talking about, so we all know we're talking about the same thing, I'm going to define it. Also known as universal basic income or UBI, basic income is just a regular income unconditionally paid to every individual person. It's free money for everyone. Basic income does not have to be an amount that meets people's basic needs. Such an amount may be both desirable and achievable, but it's not part of the definition. Basic income is basic only in the sense that everyone gets it. The income itself is basic, not what it buys. People tend to make assumptions about what the amount of the basic income should be or about what kinds of taxes or other policies would best go along with the basic income. Not everyone is careful about separating their desired parameters for basic income from the concept of basic income itself. This lack of precision can make basic income seem more complicated than it actually is. So first up, everyone asks how to pay for basic income. So I'll answer that question first, otherwise it's going to be nagging at you the whole time. There's only one way to pay for basic income, by printing new money. Anytime the government spends, basic income or otherwise, they're adding money to a part of the economy that wouldn't otherwise have that money. If you want, you can tell a story about how taxes fund the spending, but taxing money away from one part of the economy doesn't magically make room to add money to another part of the economy. That's not how money works. The right question to ask isn't, can we afford a basic income? The right question to ask is, what's the optimal level of basic income for our economy? How much basic income can our economy handle without causing inflation or other problems? To what extent will various taxes or other economic policies increase or decrease that amount? So taxes can make a difference, but it's about how will they affect the amount of the basic income. So people need money so they can buy things. Otherwise, the economy falls apart. The problem that basic income solves is straightforward. It's a source of money for people. There are other ways to get people their money. The choice is not basic income or no basic income. It's basic income or some other source of money. So what does basic income replace? What should it replace? And to what extent do we have to remove other sources of money to make room for the basic income, to give it somewhere to go? And why should we expect basic income to work better than the ways people get their money today? I like to say that you can't really understand basic income without understanding money. So let's talk about money. What is money? Money is really two things: the standard currency unit against which we set our prices, and the standardized money tokens that we spend to pay those prices. Paper money issued by the government is a form of money token, but so are deposits issued by your bank. You can spend them to claim goods and services from the economy by using your debit card. As the economy churns away, there's always a flow of money tokens moving from consumers to producers, and a flow of goods and services moving in the opposite direction. Consumers are continually claiming goods and services from the economy. That's the whole point of the economy. The amount of money chasing each individual good is that good's price, and the average amount of money chasing the average good is the economy's general price level. The price level is arbitrary. It doesn't really matter. One price level is as good as any other price level. But what does matter is that the price level doesn't change. If the price level moves around, then the currency unit isn't going to be a very useful pricing standard. How can we set prices in dollars if we don't know what a dollar is worth? If the value of a dollar bounced around too much, we never would have chosen it as our standard currency. And if it gets bad, we'll switch to a different currency even today. In the real world, some people argue that a small amount of inflation is actually good for the economy. The Fed targets 2% inflation. But by allowing some inflation, we're sacrificing some of the effectiveness of our pricing standard in order to get some other perceived benefit. Whether this is worth it is debatable. For today's purposes, let's assume that zero inflation is the ideal. The way we achieve zero inflation is by ensuring that the flow of consumer spending remains balanced against the flow of economic output. If one flow increases or decreases, the other flow must adjust along with it. Importantly, inflation is not about the amount of money in the economy. It's about the flow of money through the economy. It's not the case that there's just a certain amount of money circulating and that the mass of money simply flows in a circuit. Instead, as I said, money flows from consumers to producers. It has a source and a destination. The money tokens flow like a river through a water wheel powering a factory. Money accumulates in such a way that it disappears from the productive economy. It must be continually replenished. Basic income can be the source of that replenishment, the source of our economy's money. Our current source of money is the private financial sector. Instead of printing money directly and handing it out to people in the form of basic income, we use monetary policy to stimulate the private financial sector to push money to people through otherwise unnecessary jobs. We'd be printing money either way. The difference is that we're currently getting the private sector to print our money for us. And we're doing it that way to create jobs and keep people employed. So I would say that even private sector jobs largely constitute government make work in disguise. That's what happens when you distort the labor market away from efficiency. In an efficient labor market, jobs only exist because we actually want the product of the labor. The labor market is supposed to be a market for getting people to do things, but we're using it as a tool to push money to consumers. We're forcing people to spend their time unproductively as an excuse to pay them. Why not just hand them the money instead? That's what we do with the basic income. If we increase the basic income high enough, we'll eventually reach a point where we're no longer using the financial sector and jobs to get money to consumers. More concretely, the higher the basic income, the more the Fed can tighten monetary policy. To the extent that we're currently overstimulating the financial sector to prop up consumers and to prop up the price level, basic income gives us the freedom to not do that anymore. The question that I asked before is, what's the optimal level of basic income for our economy? How much basic income can our economy handle? What level of basic income prevents us from distorting markets away from efficiency? And then we can ask, to what extent will various taxes and other economic policies increase or decrease that amount? On its own, the concept of basic income... Wait, did I already say this? No. Okay, so why do we have a cycle of booms and recessions? Because we're overstimulating the financial sector to push money to consumers through jobs. So this is kind of a consequence of that. And this is why 2008 happened. It's why the Great Depression happened. With a basic income calibrated to its natural level, all that goes away. So if you get basic income to the right level, we don't have to use these other indirect mechanisms to prop up consumers and to prop up the price level. So I've also been asked to talk about the government independent basic income system blueprint that I designed back in 2015 called the Gresham system. I don't know if you guys remember this, but back then it looked like Greece might have to leave the Eurozone. They would have had to transition back into their own currency. Before there was Brexit, there was the threat of Grexit, the Greece exit, which never materialized. So back then I was thinking about how Greece could smoothly transition to a new currency, and I came up with an idea for how they could back the new currency against the euro, despite the fact that they were basically out of euros. The way it would work is that merchants would have to accept the new currency, we can call it the new drachma, at a fixed exchange rate with the euro. But then the drachma would be convertible to euros only after a 30-day waiting period. And then every time you spend it, the waiting period on the currency gets reset. So the more people play hot potato with their drachma, the less we have to dip into the reserve of euros. People's distrust of the Bank of Greece would actually help strengthen the new currency. They would want to get rid of their drachma as soon as possible for fear that the central bank would not be able to pay up. This resets the timer. The same psychology that would normally cause a run on the central bank would instead help shore up the reserves backing the currency. And once Greece could print its own money again, they'd also be in a position to start paying out a basic income. Unfortunately, I didn't have a line to Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek finance minister, but it was a fun thought experiment, and I decided to just get on with my life. But it didn't take me long, about a half an hour or so, for it to occur to me that we could achieve something similar through a private company, and the Gresham system was born. The Gresham system implements basic income exactly the way the government would, by printing money, and instead of directly keeping the price level stable by balancing consumer spending against economic output, we start by pegging against the dollar, exactly how Greece would have pegged against the euro, and then we piggyback on the monetary policy of the Fed. So that's it. The right way to implement basic income is to have a government do it. The Gresham system is just a hack to get around the government failing to do what they're supposed to do. In my world, the government is supposed to be paying out a basic income, and in the process, if I'm going to be honest, we would actually be kind of creating a new government with its own institutions to replace the government that failed to pay out a basic income. That's kind of like the ultimate eventuality if the Gresham system takes hold. You kind of become your own monetary authority and your own government. So that's it. That's basic income, the basics of consumer monetary theory. So consumer monetary theory is just the name I gave to how I think about how money works, how basic income fits into the economy. Money provides consumers access to the economy's output. I call it that because for a while there, people were confusing the stuff that I say with MMT, modern monetary theory, and my stuff is actually very different, and I disagree with a lot of modern monetary theory. So that's it. I'm ready for questions.
All right, Drew, go ahead. You get the first question.
All right, so I have a couple, but I'll just stick to one for now.
Sure.
So I've talked a lot about UBI and just basic income in general with people. And one of the things that I had come up with a while ago that especially it came around to criminal justice reform and how we effectively do more punishing rather than sort of active incentives to mitigate crime. And I was wondering if you think that basic income could actually act as an incentive structure to effectively incentivize people not to commit crimes. So, for example, basically you'd be paying people and saying, so I guess a lot of crime would be coming from actual lack of having, and basically I can't remember the term, but it's effectively it's like you have to steal to survive. And so I was wondering if this could be that plus like effectively we're giving you enough to survive so you're not having to commit a crime. That sort of didn't quite make perfect sense, but
Yeah, no, that's a great question. A lot of crimes certainly come from desperation. And I'm going to start with a disclaimer that there are lots of important problems that basic income doesn't solve. It solves one big problem, which is providing money to consumers. So then we can ask, well, how many of the other problems do we see in our society are caused by the fact that consumers don't have a reliable source of money, or people don't have a reliable source of money? And I think you're right. I think this is one of those things that's potentially more broken than it needs to be because the way we get people their money is broken. So if people are needlessly poor, then you see more crimes of desperation and that kind of thing. But there's kind of a whole gamut of problems that are caused by the fact that this one fundamental thing is broken.
okay, cool, thank you.
Yep.
Tim, go ahead.
Hi. So my first question is, how does can you get more into how UBI fits in the inflation mechanism and how it would cause, what relationship does it have with inflation? Does it make it worse, better? How much inflation can our economy handle? And why do we have to print money? Why can't we just tax people and try to, transport money from people that have it to the have-nots to solve the problem of the consumers not having enough money?
Yeah, so I usually like to start from the perspective of it's important that the price level be stable, that we not have inflation or deflation in order for the currency to function properly. And then, given that constraint of price stability, what can the government do? What is it possible for the government to do? So we're basically disallowing anything that would cause inflation or deflation. So if you're holding all other fiscal policy fixed, all other taxes and spending, there's a certain level of basic income that the economy can sustain at the current price level without causing inflation or deflation. What you do allow to change is you allow monetary policy to change. So basic income, it's kind of like what I was getting to when I was talking, is that it's largely a replacement for this kind of overstimulative monetary policy. So as you increase the basic income, that allows the Fed to tighten. So the Fed, they're the ones who are in charge of keeping the price level stable. So that's their mandate. Whatever wacky thing the fiscal authority does, whatever wacky thing Congress and the government, et cetera, does, the Fed has to respond in a way that keeps prices stable. So if the government starts paying out more basic income, that allows the Fed to tighten. And in terms of the printing money question, I really like to describe it as all government spending is printing money, because we can look at the government as kind of this black box, and it does its taxing and it does its spending. But if it's a black box, there's no kind of logical relationship within the inner workings of the government, because we're not allowed to see the inner workings of the government, that ties the taxing to the spending. So we know from real life, the government runs deficits. We know that that's possible. And the constraints on, if our constraint is a price stability constraint, then the question is, how does the taxing and how does the spending affect the price level? And then that determines what you're allowed to do, rather than trying to tell a story about how the money that the government spends really came from taxes or something like that. So I don't know if that answers your question 100%, but the printing money thing is partly just a matter of framing. It's saying that when the government spends, they're adding new money to the economy, because just the fact that you took money away from Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or something like that, that doesn't mean that suddenly there are more hamburgers for people to buy at fast food restaurants, right? In order for there to be more hamburgers for people to buy, the fast food restaurants would have to have the capacity to produce those hamburgers, and taking money away from Jeff Bezos isn't going to magically create that capacity. And by the same token, so taking money away from Jeff Bezos isn't going to create the capacity, and if the capacity is there, you don't need to take money away from Jeff Bezos, because you can just hand people the money so they can buy the hamburgers. And the important thing to remember is that inflation isn't about the amount of money in the economy. It's about the money flowing through the economy. So when I spend money to buy the hamburgers, the hamburger producer is people like to accumulate money. If rich people didn't like to accumulate money and they kind of spent all their money back into the productive economy all the time, then you'd have this situation where there's a certain amount of money and it's just circulating and it gets exactly back to where it started again. But that's not how the real economy works. The real economy, money accumulates, and once it's in the hands of Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, it's as if it's not in the economy anymore, so you can replace it. Now, if you wanted to, you can tell a story about, taxes funding government spending, and you could line up taxes with spending, but you might not, that constrains what your optimal results might be. You might not get the best outcome for people in general, for poor people, or even for economic efficiency, because if you try to balance taxes with government spending, then maybe the government isn't adding enough money to the economy directly, and you do have to kind of do this thing where you use the Fed to print money in the private financial sector. Because remember that new money is being created and added to the economy at all times. The question is whether we want that money to be backed by private debt in the private financial sector, which ends up becoming really unstable and then collapsing, or whether we want it to be backed by rock solid government debt, because there's only one borrower and one source of credit, and it doesn't have this kind of brittle web of interconnecting debt that can kind of collapse on itself. Yeah, I guess that's a long answer, but those were good questions.
Sorry, thank you.
Yep.
I think Drew had his hand up first, so you can go, and then after that, Joe, you can ask a question.
Hi, yeah, so I just wanted to clarify one quick thing. So you said that consumer spending caused the '08 crisis. I just wanted to know if you could clarify that, or what you meant.
Right. So it's not that consumer spending created the '08 crisis. It's that a lot of private sector borrowing created the '08 crisis. You know, it was a buildup of debt in the private financial sector that eventually collapsed on itself. But the reason we had that buildup of debt was because we were using monetary policy to stimulate the creation of more debt in the private financial sector. And the reason we were doing that was to prop up consumers and to prop up the price level. If you use the basic income to fund consumers directly, then you can rein in the private financial sector and you don't have these asset bubbles anymore.
So your concern is more of the sort of unregulation of the private sector rather than having sort of a centralized government that's going to be doing all of the sort of debt or dealing with all the debt rather.
Well, it's not a matter of regulation. So either way, you know, in both versions, the real world and my ideal world, the government is ultimately controlling the amount of money in the economy. The question is whether they're doing it directly or they're doing it through monetary policy and indirectly through the private sector, right? So the government is doing it either way. It's just a matter of whether it's hiding behind the private sector in order to do it, if that makes sense.
I think so. Yep.
Joe, go ahead.
Hey, so as everyone knows, there's been a lot of talk about the stimulus checks that the government has and hasn't given out to varying extents. Do you think these talks of stimulus checks are a good step in the right direction for achieving a universal basic income?
Yeah, I think they are. I think, you know, something we noticed with the pandemic is that a lot of our jobs are not essential, right? Like this is calling attention to the fact that maybe jobs weren't the right way to get people their money. So certainly, you know, in 2008 we had stimulus checks as well, but people weren't drawing the connection with basic income, and now they are. And I think that's largely due to Andrew Yang kind of popularizing the idea, that kind of thing. I used to say that automation is merely calling attention to the fact that jobs were never the right way to get people their money. Now my line is, you know, the coronavirus pandemic is calling attention to the fact that jobs were never the right way to get people their money. So I do think, you know, it kind of, people notice that, hey, we can give people this money and it works and they can buy things, and, you know, maybe that's a lesson we can take into the future even after the crisis is over.
So to follow up on that, so does that imply that not necessarily everyone should have a job, or like there's a limited number of productive jobs in the economy?
Yeah, definitely. It definitely implies that. So if you think about the labor market, well, let me back up a second. Naturally, we spend our time in ways that are valuable to us. We do what we want to do with our time. The labor market is a market for getting people to spend their time doing something else. And there's a certain amount of labor, certain types of labor that need to be performed in order for the economy to produce everything it needs to produce for the people. And the idea is that we want to get the incentives such that the right amount of labor and the right mix of labor is being performed in the economy. And that, you know, it doesn't have to do with not any individual person. It doesn't matter whether that person happens to be working. What matters is whether the right amount of overall labor is being contributed to the economy. So we've kind of doubled up the labor market, and we're using it for not just allocating labor efficiently, but we're also trying to use it to push money to consumers. We're trying to use it to give people like meaning and purpose in their lives and stuff like that. But to the extent that we're using it for these two other things, we're sacrificing efficiency of labor allocation.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Tim, go ahead.
Can you tell me more about the crisis that Greece has been facing for, I guess, about a decade now? Or I guess on a larger scale, Venezuela or a lot of the countries in the Middle East. And do you see Western countries, or specifically America, being close to achieving that amount of inflation as well? And what can we do to stop this? Or can UBI be sort of a remedy for that, or more like a preventive measure?
Wow, that's a lot. So
yeah, just try to like, jumble it all into one ball.
Into one simple answer, yeah. So I think I'm not an expert on Greece. I actually haven't been following them that closely. I was back then, but I know a big part of it was that Greece is part of the Eurozone. So there's a tension in the Eurozone where the fiscal authority and the monetary authorities are not at the same level. So here in the United States, the Fed has to respond to whatever the government does. In Europe, in the Eurozone, the ECB is the central bank, and they sit at a level above the individual governments. So if Greece needs to do something, run a deficit or something like that, the ECB doesn't just automatically accommodate that the way we have here. So you have countries, with very different economies in the Eurozone, and they all have to follow, they're all kind of subject to the same monetary policy. And I think that's ultimately kind of what caused the tension in Greece. And I think it's very different from what happened in Venezuela. What happened in Venezuela was you had this basically this kind of socialist regime that tried to take over all the private industries. And the main one of those industries was oil. So they had a pretty robust economy in like the 1990s, and then gradually they just became more and more dependent on exporting oil and buying everything from abroad. And they couldn't really produce their own food, other markets and stuff, since the government took it over, it became unprofitable to, have a dairy farm or something like that. And so you've got this very brittle situation where you're depending on this one export. And then in 2014, I think it was, the price of oil increased. And you might not know this about Venezuela, but their oil has a very high sulfur content. So it's very expensive to refine. So when the price of oil went up in 2014, when it spiked, Saudi Arabia could still profitably sell oil. Venezuela could not sell their oil anymore. So they had an entire economy that was dependent on this one thing that was no longer profitable. And certainly it was made worse by the fact that they didn't have markets. If you have markets and you have price mechanisms and stuff like that, you can at least maybe start to build up something in response to that crisis. But instead, they kind of doubled down on the government control, and they're unable to get out of it. And even if you have all of this bad stuff happening, you don't have to have inflation. You just have to admit, hey, we're really poor now. Our people can't have as much money. And then you can stabilize the currency. But they did the opposite of that. They said, oh, prices are going up. We need to give everyone more money, that's how you get hyperinflation. So that's kind of what happened in Venezuela. Very different situation from Greece. In the United States, I don't think we're really in any danger of anything like what happened in Greece or what happened in Venezuela. I don't see that as a problem or a potential problem.
Okay, Ethan is next, then Drew, then me, then Joe, then Amy. So slew of questions.
Hello. So you've mentioned in some earlier questions, it's come up your argument that you seem to look at jobs more as a way to get people money than I'd say just like the average layman would think, just like, oh, it's what you do because duh, it's a job.
Yeah.
And you argue that the coronavirus, the whole essential work, non-essential work, has demonstrated that a lot of jobs are not useful. This is an argument that I've more recently come across and still really don't buy that. I mean, obviously you can't just be like, this job is useful completely and this job is not. So you can't like put a percentage on supposedly useless jobs. But I just wanted to like almost like just kind of butt in and say that, the economy has gone down significantly during COVID-19 whenever we had to go to essential jobs. And then at least all the relatives that I have, which are admittedly in primarily white collar positions, but it's not like even with that, a lot of people have lost their jobs and a lot of businesses are no longer functioning. So I just don't really I was wondering if you could really just elaborate on the argument that a lot of jobs are not useful, because I just have never seen that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really good point that it's hard to kind of like identify an individual job. There are some where, it might be obvious or something, like, did we need to bail out GM, or could we have bought all our cars from Japan or something like that? Maybe those are useless jobs. Yeah, it's more property of the market as a whole rather than a property of individual jobs. And I think there's a case to be made that a lot of the jobs that we have now are really, really useful. And my response to that is to say, okay, let's calibrate the basic income to its natural level. Let's feel out what the natural level of basic income is, and then take a look around and see which jobs are remaining. If you're right that it's all the same jobs as today, then I owe you $5 or something like that. But yeah, and another thing that's important to remember is that these jobs are always useful to the company that does the hiring, right? You're not going to hire someone if it's not productive for your business, or you're trying to avoid doing that, right? So the issue is that the way we stimulate the private sector is that we make borrowing really cheap. So a lot of times businesses that wouldn't even be profitable are able to keep going and hire people because money is really cheap in the financial sector. So I think, and in terms of coronavirus, what we're noticing, so you're right that the economy is smaller, but even with the smaller economy, we're noticing that we can hand people money and they can still activate the capacity that's still active, right? So that's something important to pay attention to too. In terms of how many jobs and which jobs are the useless jobs and that kind of thing, I'm not going to try to make a strong case for any of that.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I was always confused, like, why on earth are businesses hiring people to do useless jobs? It doesn't make any sense.
They're not. They're not. It's useless businesses hiring people.
It's useless businesses.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What,
zombie companies even. Maybe.
That's actually interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think it's Drew, me, Joe, then Amy, and then I'm not sure if Tim forgot to put his hand down or if he has another question.
Yes,
So yeah, Drew, go ahead.
2 quick follow-ups. First of all, I'd actually talked to someone who was from Venezuela who had gone into detail about this, who had basically just said it was largely because of Venezuela's oil production efficiency dropping, even though they were investing more, and they basically kicked out a lot of the private companies that were actually the reason for a lot of that higher-end efficiency. But
all of that is true.
Yeah. And then I think with the useless jobs, I sort of found them kind of ironic because they're only useful in the sense of they provide jobs for people. Otherwise, they wouldn't have them. So the use in themselves is to provide those jobs, I guess, and have money, which I feel like you could perhaps argue that, the more efficient way would be to have a system that actually provides money, like basic income, as you suggested. But my question is, do you think that basic income, in the way that you've sort of envisioned it, could be or could cause a severe devaluation of accumulated wealth among those individuals with any level of accumulated wealth? So anywhere from like a little bit of money saved to a large amount of money saved?
Yes, definitely. So in a lot of ways, in a lot of different ways, actually, since a lot of people, their accumulated wealth is invested in the financial sector, if you've got, all these businesses that are suddenly now being subject to market forces and they're going out of business, that's stock prices going way down. There's a lot of people who are borrowing in order to buy stocks and other assets. If borrowing gets more expensive, they're going to have to sell. That drives stock prices down. And then another big one is the housing market, right? People need to live near where the jobs are, and that causes housing prices to go up. And people treat homes as investments, and mortgages are really cheap, so that drives up home prices as well. So if you introduce a basic income that's an income that's location independent, that gives people a lot more freedom in where to live, and you're gonna see probably some kind of housing market crash. Obviously, I advocate doing things that I don't want creative destruction. I want to maybe gradual, smooth creative destruction, but I'd want to roll things out as smoothly as possible and try to mitigate any sudden shocks or anything like that. But yeah, certainly there's a lot of money that's kind of going toward things that are a consequence of the economy being broken right now. Now, after the you can ask the question of what does the transition look like into basic income? Is there going to be some rough stuff? Hopefully we can mitigate as much of that as possible. Then you can also compare the two states of the world, the state of the world we're in now and the state of the world after we've already transitioned into basic income. In that state of the world, you would expect a robust and healthy stock market where the businesses that are the most profitable are the ones that are actually providing things that ordinary people, that benefit ordinary people. So when the people are the ones that have the money, the way to profit is by providing things for the people. So the short answer to your question is yes. but hopefully we can mitigate some of the disruption, and we'll end up in a better world at the end anyway. And I liked what you said about kind of the unnecessary jobs. And jobs are a cost, not a benefit. They're a cost to society. So anytime you hear any politician or anything like that saying, "Oh, this will create such and such number of jobs" or something like that, that is not a benefit of whatever that plan is. It is a cost, and we're putting it on the wrong side. It shouldn't be this positive bullet point. It should be like, oh, hey, we're developing all this green infrastructure, and guess what? We can do it all in an automated way. We don't have to employ anyone, and that should be what we're celebrating. But the reason we're not celebrating it in that way is because we're depending on people having jobs to get their money, and it's really holding us back from really making the economy as efficient as it could be. I like to say that automation isn't making basic income necessary, but if we have basic income, that will give us more of an incentive to automate, because now if you're calibrating basic income to kind of like the natural level for the economy, to the maximum level we can sustain, if you're eliminating jobs, that just gives people more opportunity for leisure, and it gives people potentially more money.
If you don't mind, if I could ask a quick follow-up, which would be, what are some examples of useless jobs in our economy specifically? And then also, do you see, so one of the other big things that I've sort of talked about is as you gradually move towards automation and moving out of those certain needing fewer people in those sectors, you start to see the rise of a lot more what I call cultural jobs, which are like you can be someone who streamed something online, and 20 years ago no one would think that's viable, but now YouTubers, Twitch streamers, etc. So do you think that creating jobs that are sort of like cultural jobs in that sense, in art and such, do you see that as a useful job?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. And it kind of gets into the question of what is a job. So I like to think about, people have time and they can spend their time in certain ways. And then the labor market is a market for getting people to spend their time in different ways. If it's something that they would be happy to do, maybe you don't have to pay them very much. If it's something that they really don't want to do, maybe you have to pay them more, that kind of thing. But you don't have to have this kind of dividing line between what's a job and what's not. And maybe some activities are activities that you pay to do instead of being paid to do. So, something that, like there doesn't have to be, the price can be positive or negative. The wage can be positive or negative. Maybe you're part of a sports club and they have a fee to rent the arena or something like that. Maybe that's how you spend your time. That's your job, but you're paying to do it, right? The important thing is that we don't use jobs as a mechanism to get money to people. That the only purpose of wages is to provide an incentive for people to perform that labor. So maybe someone is streaming on Twitch, but maybe you wouldn't have to pay them because it's what they want to be doing anyway, or something like that. Maybe you won't really have to pay teachers anymore in this world because everybody wants to be a teacher and is happy to do that, or something like that. There are a lot of people who would be great teachers who can't afford to be teachers because it doesn't pay enough. Basic income changes that.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. So I think I'm going, then it's Joe, then Amy. So my question was just a clarification question. So I'm trying to track like exactly how the money goes from like companies to the consumers. So right now it works where government has various taxes, and then they take those taxes and then they pay, they spend that money via various government programs. So is the argument that you're putting forward that we should try to like maximize revenue via taxes, and then the government should like get rid of as much like welfare spending, or like cut down military as much, maximize a UBI that they can give to their citizens, or is it something else that you're proposing?
No. So the idea is there's a certain level of basic income that our economy can sustain right now, without any other changes to fiscal policy. So no changes to other government spending, no changes to other taxes, right? And there's a level that of basic income that we can have that allows us to tighten monetary policy, to rein in the financial sector, to do only what it's supposed to do, only fund productive investment, that kind of thing, instead of creating jobs to push money to consumers, that kind of stuff. So the idea, so that's what I call the natural level of basic income, and the question is, what is that level? And the way we discover that level is by feeling for it. So we gradually increase the basic income, no taxes, no changes to other spending until we reach that level. Now, a question we can ask is, can we change other taxes or change other forms of government spending in a way that affects the natural level of basic income? And the answer is yes. And it's not as simple as, you increase taxes and that increases the basic income, because tax policy affects the economy in lots of different ways. For example, if we had a carbon tax, which is something we might want in order to reduce carbon emissions, then that makes the resource of carbon more expensive in the productive process. So that's going to reduce the productive capacity of the economy and actually reduce the level of basic income we can afford, because we're getting by with less. We're conserving resources, right? So there's less stuff for people to buy. And it's similar for a value-added tax. So, Andrew Yang often talks about kind of funding basic income with a VAT, but a VAT is basically a tax on all production. If we are holding the price level fixed, so we're keeping consumer prices stable, the Fed is deciding to do that, then, a lot of people talk about, the VAT, is regressive because it affects consumer prices. But if you're doing a VAT on the whole macroeconomy, then it doesn't affect consumer prices. It just creates a wedge between input prices and output prices. It makes production all across the economy more expensive. So that's going to reduce the productive capacity of the economy as well and reduce the level of basic income we can afford. And then there are other taxes that might increase the level of basic income we can afford too. Some, if you're taxing, so if someone's wasting a resource in a specific way and you tax that, then maybe it frees up the resource and leaves more for consumers, that kind of thing. Then there's also the flows of money. So there's the taxes also affect the economy because of the flows of money. So if you're taking money away from consumers, then directly, then that increases the level of basic income we can afford. And the basic income itself, of course, is a negative tax, right? You're giving people money instead of taking money away from them. So a head tax is a tax where you go around and everyone just has to pay a certain amount at regular intervals. A basic income is a negative head tax, and a head tax is a negative basic income.
So, quick follow-up question. Yeah. How can we tell when the level of basic income is too much? Is it just that our GDP goes down, or is it that companies are leaving the US? Like what kind of is the metric or the general rule of thumb for that?
Yeah, so there's a few different indicators. The one you said is basically probably the main one. You increase the basic income and it actually doesn't boost GDP anymore or something like that. Then you're kind of tapped out. Then at that point, what you're doing is you're just swapping one source of income for another. So maybe the basic income goes up by a notch, but then the amount of money people are getting from the private financial sector goes down by the exact same amount, but you're actually not increasing the economic activity anymore. And you might want to stop there, because if you go further, then that can actually, we want to crowd out private sector investment when the private sector investment is really inefficient and we're using that investment just to push money to consumers. But we don't want to crowd it out anymore when we're actually building more capacity. So if interest rates start getting too high, there's kind of a point where you're like, if they go any higher, maybe businesses aren't going to be able to borrow as much and build, capacity for our future, capital formation, all of that kind of stuff. So I would look at all of these things. I don't know that there's, I wouldn't say one number or something like that, but you can look at the economy and you can look at the financial sector. And if you have these asset bubbles building and building and building, the basic income is too low, right? And then if you get to a point where that's not really happening anymore and the financial sector is stable and you don't have this credit cycle, this business cycle of booms and busts, then you're kind of at the point, okay, the economy is basically at its natural level of basic income, which might change, right? As we build more capacity, there's room for more consumer spending. So you would expect in normal times, not coronavirus times necessarily, but in normal times, the natural level of basic income would increase over time.
Awesome, thank you. Joe, then Amy.
So in regards to like consumer level products, like food, water, other things that people need to live, do you think the prices of those will be raised by like storefronts if they know everyone can afford it with a universal basic income?
Well, I think an important concept here is, I don't know if you guys have taken any economics classes, but price elasticity of demand. So depending on how steep the demand curve is, if raising prices causes you not to lose very many customers, then maybe it's profitable to raise prices. But if lowering prices causes you to lose a lot of customers, or causes you to gain a lot of customers, then maybe it's profitable to lower prices, right? So basic income combined with monetary tightening actually flatten out the demand curve. So that makes it more profitable for producers to keep their prices lower because they can sell higher quantities. So this is kind of the opposite effect of what you see with like healthcare and tuition and rents, right? Where people have to pay whatever the price is, so they just keep jacking it up. When you have a flatter distribution of demand, that leads to higher quantities and lower prices. And that's how you can kind of get the economy to full output. I mean, obviously, if I thought I could keep all my customers and just raise the price, then I'm going to do that, right? But that's not necessarily going to be the case with something like a basic income in place that flattens out the demand curve more.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. Amy, go ahead.
Hi. So I don't have super coherent thoughts on this because a lot of this is like above me. I don't know much about economics, but I was just interested in, because you were talking about a part of the reason you think this would be helpful is so we can get rid of jobs that aren't necessary, and people can, get their money in other ways. And I'm just wondering, as far as like, as like a society, how do you think that's going to change, like what different people are going to be doing those like necessary labor jobs? Like, are we going to we're all going to be working, but not as many like hours? Is it going to fall on like a more desperate population who might need to and not be able to do, have non-labor related jobs or not have jobs? I'm just wondering like how you see like society changing and who does the remaining necessary jobs and how it's like divided, I guess.
Yeah, so certainly in the transition to basic income, there's going to be a huge cultural transition in a lot of ways, right? But in terms of who would be doing the work, the important thing is to have the incentive such that enough work is being contributed to the economy, enough labor is being contributed to the economy, and I would imagine that some of that would involve some people. Maybe I don't want to use the word work because a lot of work is unpaid and people just spend their time working on what they're working on. But in terms of labor, in terms of paid labor, maybe some people would be paid less, some people would work less, some people might work more, or some people might be paid more. Like there might be some jobs that people really don't want to do, and the wages for those jobs would go way up. They're low now because people are desperate, right? But I don't think you'd end up in a situation where everyone's just kind of contributing equally or something like that, because that's not how incentives work. Different people have different preferences, and it takes a different amount of money to get someone to get different people to get off their ass and go mop the floor somewhere or something like that. So the ones you said the ones who are more desperate might be the ones who do the less appealing jobs. And I think to some extent that's probably right. The question is whether they would actually be desperate in absolute terms or not, or if it would just be that they want the extra money, and there are other people who already have the extra money from some other means, and they're not going to go do that job or something like that.
All right, that makes a lot more sense. Thanks.
Yep.
Awesome. Drew, and I don't know if Joe forgot to lower his hand or if he has another question.
Yeah, so I actually was going to ask a very similar question to Amy, but sort of shifting away from that then, what happens when you have, so in economics, obviously we know that it's very clear that people don't always act rationally. And so what happens in society when, even though you have incentive structures to get people, like for example, like a fast food job is something that our society leans heavily on so that just for whatever reason, I guess. Um, what happens when, even though you're willing to pay a lot of money, um, and people still don't want to do it? So then you have a shortage of workers, but then you also don't have. I guess my question is, what happens when, like, do you see a lot of jobs just going away, like fast food jobs entirely going away because of a job that would be too expensive to maintain because then food prices would go up, and it's also not there's not a high enough incentive for people to work there in the first place when they already have a basic income. So sorry, I sort of butchered that question, but it's basically the idea of, is there a sort of a pretty marginally large loss of jobs that we would both still want or still need, but then also, because people either act irrationally or people just don't have the incentives to do it, that we lose forever.
Yeah, I think that's right. Obviously, at the level of the macroeconomy, if we set the basic income at such a level that the price level starts going up because people aren't working enough, then we've set the basic income too high. We've calibrated it incorrectly. We've overshot the natural level of basic income, and then inflation will bring the purchasing power of the basic income back down to a level the economy can handle again. But in terms of individual types of jobs, yeah, for sure. So your example of fast food, maybe it creates an incentive for McDonald's to automate faster or something like that, and you just have one guy who's paid a lot overseeing the machines or something like that. But yeah, you'd see a lot of changes like that.
Right. I feel like we already see that with, as minimum wage is going up in areas that's happening. You also see a lot more automation of like kiosks at fast food places,
Yeah.
and having people sort of cooking in the back rather than having a full staff in the front.
Yeah, that's right. And with something like basic income, you could even see minimum wage go away. Like, what's the point of minimum wage, right? That's a symptom of the fact that we're expecting people to get their money from jobs, right? If we only cared about money as an incentive for people to spend their time doing something different, you don't need wage restrictions or anything like that. There's a whole possibility of how people might spend their time that falls somewhere between volunteer work and what would be considered minimum wage that's just untapped right now.
Right. So so you had mentioned like sort of forming like a new government to establish something like this. Is that, so you're essentially effectively you'd be creating your own sort of bureaucracy to create all the price scaling and all the individual prices for every single thing, and every single job would be valued, and you just have this massive team of economists that's trying to determine this, and business leaders? Or would it just be sort of a small group at the top making these decisions? Because I
So
definitely see a lot of issues if it's just some sort of small
yeah,
group,
definitely
large
not.
infrastructure.
That sounds like a terrible idea. I was mostly referring to having to, if we implemented the Gresham system, which is a basic income system that's independent of any existing government, then that entails becoming our own monetary authority. So we'd have to do our own monetary policy to keep the price level stable, that kind of stuff. We'd have to kind of create a replacement for the Fed. Initially, we're piggybacking on the dollar, but eventually we kind of graduate into our own free-floating global currency system. And it's basically, yeah, so you would basically take over the world in that sense, but you would still want the markets to do what they do. You can't get information about efficient production if you don't have the price information from the markets, that kind of thing. There are certain things that it's more efficient for the government to provide, but it's not everything.
And sorry if one quick follow up. Are you concerned about corruption in that at all? So, for example,
Yeah,
I mean, massive lobbying now in Congress, which is a huge problem. People that already have their own individual incentives. So, for example, people at the top having more incentives to change policies that make the system inefficient, and also they still line their pockets, and so you still end up with the same issue of people at the top that can sort of abuse the system. So, is there
yeah.
a check and balance system that you have in
Yeah,
this?
definitely. We'd have to worry about all of that stuff. This is why part of why I'm not excited about doing it myself and hoping to leave basic income to existing governments. But anytime you have this kind of central authority who's making the rules or setting the policies for everyone else, or enforcing the policies for everyone else, then you run into that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's just like the most efficient thing to do is have a centralized authority, and you got to have a government, setting the laws and setting certain things, and you gotta deal with all of that stuff. But it's a headache, and I don't want to have to deal with it.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome. Frederick, I have a question, then Amy.
Yeah, so I was wondering, this has been touched on a good bit, I think, but I wanted to ask like a little more directly, like, so with the inevitability kind of like the economy being taken over by automation and more jobs just being replaced by robots. So do you see UBI as like a like very strong way to combat just like massive class disparity and like yeah, basically the issues that'll come with that?
Yeah, so this is not how I generally frame UBI, and I don't think the kind of automation takeover is something that's inevitable. I wrote an article on my blog entitled "The Robots Are Not Coming," and I think the reason for that is because the level of employment has nothing to do with how much labor we need. It has everything to do with how many jobs we want people to have because we want to push money to consumers. So we're using economic policy to create jobs for people, and that's the status quo. And there's no reason why it can't continue. So if you talk to some people, especially on the left, they talk about things like a job guarantee program. So make the status quo explicit, give everyone a government job, that kind of thing. And that just if you do that, the robots are not going to take over if you just keep doing that. And we kind of keep doing that throughout history. Like automation is not a new thing. Technological advancement is not a new thing. We are making up jobs for people to do throughout history as we become more efficient. There's something called in economics called the productivity paradox, where people are wondering, well, why is it, we have all this technology, why isn't productivity growing faster than it is? It's because we're creating unproductive jobs as a way of paying people. So I would say, I kind of said this earlier, but automation, we see it. We see how powerful it is. But I would say that it's calling attention to the fact that jobs are not the right way to get people their money. It's not actually going to make a basic income necessary, because the automation can't happen unless we let it happen. Once you have the basic income in place, that allows us to eliminate the jobs we should have been eliminating for centuries, that should have been automated away, right?
Awesome. So I think it's me, and then Amy had a question. So my question is, earlier on you mentioned modern monetary theory versus your consumer monetary theory. So I was wondering if you could just, generally speaking, go over like the differences between the two, or like the problems you have with modern monetary theory.
Yeah, so this isn't exactly fair because there's nobody here to defend modern monetary theory. So it's going to be a little bit of a biased take. But MMT was originally designed as an economic framework for understanding how to bring the economy to full employment. So there were some economic thinkers who were unhappy with how we tried to achieve unemployment. They thought, Keynes was onto something in the 1930s with involuntary unemployment. So it's a really employment centered framework. And the way they describe how money works is that money is fundamentally tax credits that are spent into the economy. So the idea is that the government says, I'm imposing a tax on you. You need to pay me or you'll get thrown in jail. And meanwhile, here are these things you can use to pay your taxes. We'll give them to you if you do work for us. So money is essentially a work-based instrument. It's a labor-based instrument. The idea is that the government creates unemployment by imposing the tax, and then they employ people by giving them the money that they can use to pay the tax. So MMT's entire framework around money is that it's this it's these kind of labor credits to prove that you've contributed your labor, or maybe you traded it with someone else, but then you ultimately pay the tax. So money is tax credits. I do not think about money that way at all. I think about money kind of like I was saying, that it's the economy's standard of value. It's the tokens. Money is a form of debt. It's a form of government debt. And the promise that's being made is that you can claim a certain amount of goods and services from the economy. And the way we make that promise is by keeping the price level stable with respect to a basket of consumer goods and services. So that's the consumer price index. That's the promise that the government is making. The government, of course, is collecting taxes in terms of the currency, but they're doing it for the same reason everyone else does, because that's the standard unit of payment in our economy. It's not that money is fundamentally a tax credit. So that's one issue I have with basic, or maybe that's a couple different issues combined that I have with modern monetary theory. They also don't really believe in the power of the Fed. They don't believe that the Fed is able to rein in inflation. They think it should all be done through taxes. They focus on the, like earlier I was talking about the flows of money in the economy, that inflation is determined by the flow of consumer spending and the flow of economic output. They focus on the amount of money. And they talk about, well, how large is the private sector's balance sheet? How large is the government's balance sheet? That kind of thing. And so they're really focused on this kind of quantity theory of money approach. How much money is in the economy determines the price level. I do not subscribe to that. They're a little more... they actually kind of, I should take that back. They are still thinking about kind of the stock of money in the economy, but they are thinking about it in reverse. That economic activity kind of determines how much money gets created in the economy. But they're still thinking about the money stock and not the money flow. So that's more the Keynes perspective, money demand versus money supply. But both the money demand perspective and the money supply perspective in kind of orthodox economics is based on stock. How much... For Keynes, it's how much money do people want to hold, and then for Milton Friedman, it's how much money is out there. That's the supply versus the demand. Whereas I say, as with everything else in economics, supply and demand are flows. How much spending is there? How much production is there? That kind of thing. And then it kind of matches up with the rest of economics a little bit better. So I think a big part of what I disagree with MMT about is stuff that they agree with mainstream economics about, which is that, oh, we need people to have jobs. We need to bring the economy to full employment, that kind of thing.
Awesome. I think, Amy, you had a question?
I backtracked on my question because I wasn't quite sure how to word it.
Okay.
Oh, I can say one more thing about MMT, which is why sometimes people confused my thinking with MMT, which is that one of the most famous and most controversial points that MMT makes is that governments don't have to balance their budgets. And that's something I actually agree with. So that's why people kind of tended to lump me in with MMT. But I disagree with basically all of MMT except for that part.
Awesome. Amy, I see your hands up, so go ahead.
All right, I'll just go ahead and it's not going to be very eloquent or anything, but I just wondered because you talked earlier about if a government isn't able to really successfully do basic income, that could be done privately, and that could sort of create a new government UBI. I think that works better. I'm just wondering if it would be possible to have, and it may not, if it would be possible to have some sort of stable long-term basic income that doesn't come from a government. So that was just my question, putting it bluntly.
Yeah, it's tricky. In order to have that, you would have to have a money that's not coming from a government, not managed by a government. And that's tricky because fundamentally what money has to be in order for it to be useful as money is it has to have this stable price. So the question is, what mechanism is keeping it stable? Originally, when we started using money, it was denominated in things like grain or precious metals or something like that. And the reason we used those things was because they had a generally accepted price and it wasn't going to move around too much. And it was widely accepted as valuable, that kind of thing. So those turned into our currencies, and in turn, and our units ended up being kind of calibrated to those. But the thing is that you can still have market forces pushing around the price of those things. We saw that with gold and the metal currencies and stuff like that. With fiat currency, with an actual institution that's managing the currency, you have this situation where if market forces push prices in one direction, monetary policy comes in and pushes back in the other direction to keep it stable. And you can't really have that without government institutions, I don't think. So I don't think you can even have at this point, you're not going to really be able to have a kind of money money even, let alone a basic income that competes with a well-managed fiat currency. But I think, in terms of a basic income, the question is, I tend to advocate calibrating the basic income to its natural level. Who's doing that calibration? Even if you have some kind of automatic algorithm or something like that, it's got to be based on information. It's got to be based on prices in the economy. It's got to be based on decisions about what goes into the consumer price index. Judgments about what are the ordinary things that people buy that we need to keep prices stable relative to. So who's measuring those prices? That comes back to people again, and then who's making these decisions. And it's not something you can ever. There's always, if you automate one part or turn it into an algorithm, there's always the next level down. And this is the problem with cryptocurrency as well. If you look at something like Bitcoin, the fact that the blockchain is immutable and uncorruptible and something like that, that's analogous to like gold molecules being immutable and uncorruptible. That doesn't mean that when we used gold as our monetary standard that it wasn't hugely influenced by governments, and the actual money that we used was a superstructure of credit and debt that was built on top of gold, so there were IOUs denominated in gold and that kind of thing. Like, you're fixing one part of the picture, but you're not escaping from government. You're not escaping from institutions. If you want to have an actual stable money, you need those institutions.
All right, thanks.
Awesome. So we'll start wrapping this up soon. So we'll only take like a couple more questions. But Henry, you can go ahead. Then Drew, and if you have any like pressing questions, please raise your hand. Yeah, go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation so far, by the way. I'm enjoying it. All good, very interesting stuff. But as you were talking about with, we were just talking about like a long-term, like how would the UBI be carried out long-term? I know Alaska and their petroleum dividend that they've been doing for many years now, it's kind of fallen into this political pitfall now where a lot of people in Alaska are actually dependent in that way to, like at least a percentage of the population, is a large percentage of the population depends on getting that petroleum dividend to afford like basic items and stuff. But it's basically there's like a political pitfall where there's like this constant debate as to how much it should be, and it's really become politicized. Like, and I guess just seeing that play out in Alaska, it's been a good thing, but just seeing that just really, I mean, it's not like the amount is not at a stable amount. It's like shifting from like $600 to $1,200. It's like going all over the place, and it's subject to a lot of political nonsense, frankly. So like if it was to be implemented in the United States, a universal basic income, like what measures could be taken to prevent a UBI from becoming over politicized and destroying its, true ability to help people?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, and you can ask the same question about something like monetary policy, and people have asked this question, and we've kind of run into problems with it, like in the 1970s with Nixon, getting the Fed to keep interest rates low when they shouldn't have, and that kind of thing. So I think, one of the main things we can do is similar to what we did with the Fed, have an independent institution that's responsible for calibrating the basic income. So it wouldn't be as subject to the whims of politics. Obviously, there's no way to get away from it completely. But I think another important thing is that when we start implementing the basic income, or when we start introducing the basic income, we have the right theory behind it, and we have the right kind of goals behind it. Like we say, well, the economy has a natural level of basic income. We want to calibrate to that level. So at least we're clear on what the objective is, and then maybe politics might pull us away from achieving that objective, but at least it's written down like this is what we're trying to do. Alaska doesn't really have something like that. Their basic income is based on, oil revenue that's invested in a fund. And, like you said, it's subject to all kinds of politics. We can avoid some of that by at least having a clear mission of what we're trying to achieve with the basic income. And I just kind of want to comment on something you said at the beginning, which was that, people are becoming dependent on it, and that's part of why it's politicized. I want to emphasize that we are all self-sufficiency is inefficiency. It's very inefficient. If everyone was self-sufficient, we'd destroy the planet really quickly. We are all dependent on society, right? The question is, how do we want to be dependent and in what ways? So if the government is forcing us to be dependent on jobs for our income, that's one form of dependence. And it's still dependent on the government. And if we're dependent on the government directly through the basic income, that's another form of dependence. And the fact that you have that form of dependence, that's, as long as it can be sustained, right? As long as the basic income, and this is kind of what you were getting to, as long as the basic income can be sustained, that's okay. But we have other forms of dependence that we have been sustaining for a long time, and there's no reason why we couldn't do that with a basic income too.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you.
Awesome. Drew, and we have space for one more question, so if anyone has anything pressing, please raise their hand.
Yes, I just want to say thank you also as well for answering all my questions. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your talk. So, do you see? So basically, recently Jerome Powell effectively said that the Phillips curve is entirely ineffective because there's so little relation between unemployment and inflation now. And they've basically the Fed's been trying to get inflation above 2% and has been struggling. Do you see this change as something that would affect your ideas for basic income, and perhaps how you would either try to implement that, or maybe the changing nature of our current economy away from this sort of relation between unemployment and inflation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship between unemployment and inflation certainly depends on jobs being the way people get their money. So if people get their money through basic income and you're calibrating the basic income, that completely blows up the Phillips curve, right? Even if the Phillips curve still meant anything, it wouldn't mean anything
Right.
anymore in a basic income world. In terms of the Fed being able to achieve inflation, they've been below their 2% target, but I don't, if the Fed wanted more inflation, they could do it. Like, that's not a problem. Maybe some of their estimates are a little bit off or something like that. But there's plenty of things they could do. They could buy up more assets. They could blah, 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 blah. They have ways of throwing money at the economy and causing inflation. That's not a problem and never an issue. That being said, with the basic income in place, as you increase the basic income, that allows the Fed to tighten and maybe pull back from this kind of extreme position that they're in with zero interest rates and quantitative easing and all of that kind of stuff. And then Federal Reserve monetary policy might start to look a little bit more normal again, as interest rates are positive and, they can just do the old thing that they used to do before 2008.
Right. When I think that, the insane levels of debt that we have now, especially because of COVID, have entirely exacerbated that situation with the Fed's balance sheet. And then I also think that it's, at least for me, it's this constant level of basically no interest rate. So there's this constant investment in stocks rather than any sort of other, opportunity that's perhaps more stable. And I just sort of wonder if that not only perhaps, I mean, it definitely incentivizes people within the actual stock market itself and, people with pre-existing investments, but then it also, I wonder if that's, it's sort of going back to one of my earlier questions of, people at the top being able to also then effectuate change that benefits them. I wonder if it's maybe, more behind the scenes stuff such as that, you would have to, when you actually like fully go through the establishment of the system that you would implement to create a basic income, and how you'd prevent that sort of checks and balances, or create the checks and balances rather. So yeah, that was just a little bit all over the place, but thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right that incentives are all out of whack in the financial markets. I'm not too worried about the Fed's balance sheet because it can grow indefinitely. It can't shrink indefinitely, but they can do other things that are equivalent to shrinking it, even if it's at zero and stuff like that. So it's not like the Fed's balance sheet itself is unsustainable or unstable or something like that. It's more what about the private sector's balance sheet? How is that affecting things? So, if the Fed wanted to tighten, they could tighten by shrinking their balance sheet and selling more treasuries onto the market and raising interest rates that way, sucking out reserves. They could also tighten by raising interest on reserves, which is something we were doing. So the interest on bank reserves is basically what they were doing until COVID hit, where they pay out just interest to banks, and banks are not going to lend if the rate they get on their lending is less than the rate that they get from the government on their own reserves. So there's a few ways the Fed can tighten. I'm not too worried about the balance sheet itself. I don't think that's a problem. It could be 500 times as big as it is now, and that would not be a problem.
Other countries might have an issue with that, but
yeah, I guess there's the actual economics, and then there's the perception of what matters, because they can, it's just a matter of what they do with respect to what the economy needs.
Awesome. So with that, I don't see any more questions. We're going to end the event. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Alex, for your speech. I think everyone here enjoyed it. Stay tuned for our announcements chat. I will be dropping the link to Alex's podcast. So he does a weekly podcast on Wednesdays, 7 to 9, right?
Yeah, and it's open participation. So, or most weeks it's open participation, and on the weeks that it's not, we still get some participation from people, from the non-featured guests. So yeah, it's weekly Zoom chat that live streams on YouTube and also goes out as a podcast.
Yep. And we will be releasing the recording of this meeting on our YouTube channel. We're just, going through the technicalities of switching our emails and all that stuff. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Thank you all for coming. And feel free to leave. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for all your questions, guys. They were great.
Thank you for coming on.
thank you for your time, Alex.